Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event, Catholic Women in Mexican Politics, 1750-1940, a conversation with UC Berkeley's History Department's professors, Margaret Chowning and Lena Schneider, and PhD candidate Giselle Perez-Leon. I am Janet Wagman, the program manager at the UC Berkeley Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. I'm happy to be here today and have the opportunity to host you to highlight new work from UC Berkeley scholars on Latin America and the Caribbean. In a minute, I will hand it over to the speakers for today's event. But before I do that, let me provide a brief introduction. Margaret Chowning is professor and Son Chair in Latin American History in the Department of History at UC Berkeley. Her research interests are Mexico, Latin America in the late colonial period and 19th century, women, church, and social and economic history in Latin America. Elena Schneider is an associate professor of history at UC Berkeley. Her research focuses on Cuba and the Caribbean, comparative colonialism and slavery, and the Black Atlantic. Giselle Perez-Leon is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at UC Berkeley. Her research traces the development of public services and municipal governance in Nogales, Sonora between 1918, when the first physical boundary divided ambos Nogales, and 1965, when investments from the Mexican National Border Program, PRONAF, and the Binational Border Industrialization Program rebuilt the Nogales Gateway. Chowning's latest work is Catholic Women and Mexican Politics, 1750-1940, which was released by Princeton University Press in 2023. In this book, Professor Chowning tells the untold story of how the Mexican Catholic Church in the 19th century excluded, then accepted, and then came to depend on women as leaders in church organizations. But much more than a study of women and the church or the feminization of piety, the book links new female lay associations beginning in the 1840s to the surprisingly early politicization of Catholic women in Mexico, drawing on a wealth of archival materials spanning more than a century of Mexican political life. Chowning boldly argues that Catholic women played a vital role in the church's resurrection as a political force in Mexico after liberal policies left it for dead. Shedding light on the importance of informal political power, this book places Catholic women at the forefront of Mexican conservatism and shows how they kept loyalty to the church strong when the church itself was weak. During the event, we welcome questions from the audience, and we have enabled the Q&A feature on Zoom, which you can find the Q&A button on the bar below me. Now, I hand it over to Professor Margaret Chowning.
Thanks, Janet. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to start by talking briefly about how this book came about. It could be a really long story because the book was a long time coming. It started in 1999, the year that I published my first book. And I was a little tired of economic history. My idea was to do something completely different. And I thought, okay, gender and religion, that's quite a switch. It sounds great. So my hope was that indirectly this would shed light on conservative politics in Mexico. As my first book, I hoped had kind of indirectly shed light on liberal politics. In my early research on women and the church, which at that time included nuns, I came across a bunch of really magnificent materials that caused me to detour. I wrote a different book that I published in 2006, and so I didn't return to this book until the year after that. It was fortuitous, really, because by this time a number of important dissertations had come out that were not available in 1999, at least most of them. And these dissertations were looking at women in the church in the 1920s and 1930s, when female Catholic activists were highly visible political actors in protests against the revolution's effort to clamp down on the church. So the appearance of these dissertations led me to do more than just analyze the changing relationship between women and the church, and instead, in addition to doing that, to focus directly on Catholic women in politics before the 1920s. Most of these dissertations, just to repeat myself, had concentrated on the 20s and 30s. My hypothesis was that the changing relationship between women and the church was connected to the emergence of Catholic women activists as early as the 1850s, and that we needed to abandon the idea that Catholic women did not burst onto the political scene until 70 years later. Among other things, thinking of the 1920s female activism as the first evidence of such activism in Mexico put an emphasis on influences on these women from global sources. Whereas if I was right, there was an autochthonous story of Mexican women's political actions that can even be seen as dating back to the colonial period. So sources were already not going to be that easy for a study of the changing relationship between women and the church. And now I'd added a whole new dimension to the project that required a new methodology, one that would combine social history of women in lay associations, which was my unit of analysis, with a study of political action and discourses, liberals and conservatives mobilizing gendered language in the political arena. So social history and discourse history can fruitfully be employed separately, of course, but I thought that together they would be more powerful, even if twice the amount of work. Social history could establish a story about women in church institutions, but it couldn't explain their move into national politics. Similarly, by bringing gender to the surface of politics, I thought, doing something important, but gendered political discourses are often made much more intelligible when paired with gendered social and institutional history. So I created more work for myself, but I think created a better book in the process. So the book's conclusions, I think, if I do say so myself, are surprising and significant. I was able to show that women began to take on leading roles in the church in the 1840s. As I said before, the main unit of analysis is the lay association or cofradia. Without going into too much detail, the majority of colonial cofradias were complex institutions with business interests, large budgets, perhaps because of this, but maybe just mainly because it was the natural order of things. No one questioned that men should always be the leaders and the officers in the cofradias, although women, I was able to document, somewhat surprisingly, I think, constituted a majority of the membership of most of those colonial cofradias. So the colonial cofradias hit a crisis at the time of Mexican independence from Spain. Basically, what happened is that these complex and expensive institutions began to fall apart under the financial pressures of the devastating wars for independence. Without cofradias, there was an impoverishment of religious practice. So the crisis of the cofradias was, in a real sense, a crisis of the Catholic Church. The solution came into view in 1839 when 31 women in the town of San Miguel de Allende proposed to organize a new, simpler religious institution that could be led, in fact, by constitution, was required to be led by women. This was the Vela Perpetua, a devotional cofradia that organized women to sit vigil in front of the Blessed Sacrament for 12 hours every day from 6 to 6. Men could join if they wanted, and they would be, if there were enough of them, they would be assigned to extend the vigil from 6 to 9 o'clock at night. But when men did join, importantly, by the constitution of the Vela, they would be governed by the female officers. So, in other words, the Vela's constitution came up squarely against the norm of gender hierarchy in church institutions. Women just couldn't govern men. But on the other hand, the church was in crisis, the cofradias were in crisis, and the Vela promised to bring 1,500 people a month into the parish church outside of the Mass to establish a presence in the church, and to do so without relying on overworked priests to fill the gap. This was pretty attractive, and so after much hemming and hawing, the Vela was approved by the bishop and spread rapidly throughout Mexico, in the parts of Mexico, especially where the old cofradias were especially dysfunctional. The dominance of women in these associations just kept increasing over the century. An 1897 survey of parishes in the Archbishop of Mexico reveals that almost 85% of the lay associations were either all female or mixed gender with female leadership. That's pretty impressive, 85%. What this means is priests who had been pushed to accept women because of the church being in crisis, because of the economic story, had come to depend on women who kept the churches open, decorated, filled, organized activities, active. This lively picture challenges the dominant view of the church as a church in decline until at least the late 19th century. If you, what it shows, I think, is that if you focus on women, the women who supported the church, rather than focusing on the men who abandoned the church, the picture looks very different. Okay, so that's one surprising conclusion. The second is that in places where women assumed new roles in the church, they were also early entrants into Mexican politics. This was my hypothesis, and it was, I think, correct. This was a turn of event that was much remarked upon in the liberal and conservative press, even though it's been erased by official liberal histories since then. The press didn't pay much attention to women's lay associations. You don't learn about the Vela Perpetua from the press, but it did pay attention when women acted politically. The first petition campaign in which women's participation caused a ruckus came in 1856. Women in 17 towns wrote petitions against the proposal to include religious tolerance in the new constitution, which would have meant the end of Catholicism as Mexico's official church. All but one of these petitions came from towns that had also formed new women's associations. Now, this doesn't prove that the associations, the members of the associations, wrote the petitions or even organized campaigns to collect signatures, but it's pretty suggestive, and in the book I have other evidence that suggests that there was this connection. These petitions were met with astonishment, according to a leading liberal paper. From the liberal point of view, it was a world turned upside down. When the weaker sex leaves her sphere in order to take part in public matters, she is as out of place as a member of the stronger sex dedicating himself to domestic chores. The liberal strategy to diminish the effect of the women's petitions will sound familiar to you. Politics was an inappropriate place for women. Women should stay out of politics. There were a lot of reasons given in the liberal press for this. Women were too good or too pure for politics, or they weren't savvy enough to know that they were being manipulated by priests that were desperate, so desperate that they were forced to turn to women for support. The Catholic press also had to come to terms with women's entry into politics. Most of the male writers didn't really believe that women belonged in politics any more than the liberals did. The conservative press insisted that the signers of the petitions were not ignorant or manipulated, but rather respectable women who knew exactly what they were doing. They'd probably agonized about whether or not to enter politics, but in the end had chosen to defend God and the church. They had, as one conservative writer put it, as much capacity to think for themselves, to reflect, to make judgments, and to decide their position as men, which is actually, if you think about it, pretty astonishing statement. The Catholic press then made the decision in 1856 to accept women's support, probably with some misgivings, as partners in their core political projects, just as parish priests had also, perhaps reluctantly, made the decision to accept women as leaders of lay associations in their towns. The second major entry of women into politics came 18 years later, after the triumph of liberalism in Mexico. In December of 1874, a law was passed by the Congress that was meant to establish clearly, once and for all, the principle of the subjection of the church to the state. This set off another Catholic petition campaign. This time there were over 300 protestas, as they were called, written, almost 60% of which came from women. There were significant differences between the 1856 petitions and the ones in 1875. The liberal press in 1856 had depicted women as innocents, but it was now more common for the liberals to be pretty vicious. One newspaper featured on the front page a satirical piece ridiculing women's shallowness, women's commitment to and understanding of the politics that they had become engaged in. The author imagined conversations between two girls, Lola and Lupe, and their two mothers. And I'm going to read them because I think I have enough time. It causes me to go a little bit beyond my 15 minutes, but it's an entertaining piece, I think, and it shows, I think, the seriousness with which the liberals, this is a front page piece, the seriousness with which the liberals took this conservative women's petitions. The dialogue begins with the girls. Did you already sign the protesta, Lola? Of course, Chula. You know that it is all the vogue to protest. How many times have you protested? Just once. Well, I have signed 4 times. Aye, where can I go to protest more? I want to protest 10 times. Meanwhile, the mothers are sharing strategies for racking up more signatures. And you haven't even sent your maids to go protest? What do you think, Juanita? The maids are so useless. Yesterday, I allowed the bedroom maid and the seamstress to go to church for Ash Wednesday and to sign a protest. They got the ashes on their foreheads, but then went for a canoe ride in Santa Anita. What about getting Lucecita to sign? But she's only 3 years old. It doesn't matter. Why not? Listen, Nina, why don't you come with us to look for signatures? All of us in the Vela Perpetua go around collecting signatures. We go into the tenements, which besides being a good work, because many women sign, is a lot of fun. Then the dialogue switched back to the daughters. Do you worry that people will say we should not interfere in matters that don't concern us? Don't worry about them, Chula. I am now content with my 4 protests, but I can't wait for Congress to open, because if they present a budget, then I will protest and go out and collect signatures. If they pass a railroad law, I'll protest again. Whatever they do, I will protest. Those damn heretics. It's for this that we will protest and re-protest until kingdom comes. We'll see who wins, them with their laws or us with our protests. Very good, my child, says one of the mothers. Above all, we must defend religion, even if it means having to leave your boyfriends. Oye, Lola, is it really necessary to leave our boyfriends? When it is necessary, we will do it. Well, then, this is serious. Okay, so that's the liberals. The conservative press coverage of the petition campaigns changed more fundamentally, I think, between the 2 episodes. In 1856, the Catholic press spent a lot of time criticizing liberals' disrespect for women and other issues other than the central one, the question of whether women should stay out of the political arena. By the 1870s, however, conservatives were active and mainly enthusiastic supporters of women's roles in politics, and they embraced the image of women as warriors in the cause of Catholicism. They made fun of the liberals' continuing insistence that women should stay at home and abstain from politics. What happened, one paper asked sarcastically, to emancipation? Now it's not convenient anymore. We see it this way: when a woman's husband, brother, etc. allows a woman to protest, it is not because he is dominated by the skirts, but out of respect for freedom of opinion and of conscience, a glorious victory of the century of light. Okay, so to conclude, I think the book does justice to underappreciated actors, these Catholic women activists, but I also tried to say something about liberal women. Jean Franco years ago observed, without venturing much of an explanation, that while women writers all over the continent, she mentions Harriet Beecher Stowe in the US, as well as some Cuban, Peruvian, Argentine women, struggled, she continues to find spaces for themselves within the debate on national formation. There are no parallels to these women in Mexico. Mexican women were slow to challenge the domestication of women and often fearful of taking a step into areas where their decency would be put into question. She's right that liberal women in Mexico were largely silent, but she misses an obvious explanation: that Catholic women had been so unsilent. The liberal critique of activist Catholic women in politics was shrill, and discursively it trapped liberal women in the roles which Catholic women had at least temporarily escaped: mothers and wives who had to stay at home. Liberals painted their own wives and daughters and sisters and mothers into a corner. Women who stayed at home to take care of their family were good, while the Catholic women who had entered the public sphere were at best deluded and at worst malign influences on their families. I argue that even liberal women's sociability was damaged by liberal discourse on the need for women to stay out of the public sphere. It wasn't until very late in the Diaz dictatorship, with the revolution on the horizon, that women finally began to form clubs and associations that were not connected to the church. Partly this is because lay associations dominated by women had sort of sucked the oxygen out of the room. But I think the image of the good liberal woman who stays at home was very powerful in dampening the sociability of liberal women. Okay, since I've gone beyond my 15 minutes, I just want to highlight one of the implications of the book, which is that I think it joins a small literature that's beginning to decenter the revolution in Mexican history and instead to argue for the reform, the time of the first round of women's petitions, as a significant rupture or turning point in Mexican history. Okay, thanks.
Margaret, thank you. That was a fantastic encapsulation of your book, and really difficult to do. An economical and precise encapsulation of your book, so thank you. Margaret, you're such a bastion of teaching and service and mentorship and graduate training in the field of Latin American history on our campus and off, that you do so much for other people. It's such a rare moment and a great one to actually talk about you and about your research. So thank you for inviting Giselle and me to do that today. And it turns out there's a lot to celebrate about this new book, and we're not the only ones who think so. We just found out that the book has been awarded from LASA, the Howard F. Klein Book Prize in Mexican History, which is basically the best book prize you can win in Mexican history from the Latin American Studies Association. This is not public knowledge yet, so I'm leaking it. But it's presented annually to the author of an outstanding book of major importance to the development of the field of Mexican history, published in English or Spanish. So congratulations for that. And and also I'm not surprised. And the reason I'm not surprised is that Margaret has been for some time one of the foremost historians of 19th century Mexico and also of gender, women, and religion in Latin America. And this book is a beautiful capstone to many decades of thinking, working, and researching along these themes, and that she's also published a number of articles in the process of working on this book that have also been deeply influential and have previewed a bit of the argument. But in doing so, your two prior books, this book, the articles and book chapters, you've really worked to redefine how we understand change and continuity in the Mexican experience across the 19th century in pretty dramatic ways. So I think that, collectively, this book and your prior work have really made us reckon in new ways with many of the continuities across the supposed rupture of both the war for independence from Spain and, as you just mentioned, the Mexican Revolution. And also, of course, collectively, your prior work and this book also make us draw our attention to the ongoing critical importance and resilience of both the church and Catholicism in Mexican life, despite national debate, despite national politics that have repeatedly targeted them for eradication. So, and Margaret does this in this book in her sort of quintessential way of taking seriously the local, the provincial, and everyday experience in order to give us a whole new angle on the loftiest national debates and historiographic questions and put them in a new light. She's been doing that since before it was cool. The book asks, as she's made clear, what can explain the remarkable resilience of Catholicism in Mexican public and private life, and also the prominent role women have played in that story despite male-dominated church hierarchies. And I actually, it's hard to encapsulate it as well as you do yourself, but I noticed that the way you write this in the introduction is typically, Margaret, like very concise, colloquial. I mean, it's very accessible language, but it's also, there's a lot going on. So the way you put it in the introduction, Margaret, is how have religion and the churches that organize religion survived and even thrived since the 19th century? And does gendering the question provide fresh answers? And what I like about that, it's a question about religion and the church and their persistence and survival and even thriving since the 19th century. But also, what does gendering the question do? What I like about that is the book is really an argument about the church and national politics and the culture wars between liberals and conservatives, but also an argument about the history of women and how they intersect. And to pull that off is quite difficult. To do both is quite difficult. And I think she gave you a pretty good overview, but also in typical Margaret fashion, she gives a really excellent sort of capsule version of the book in her own introduction that is more concise and better put than I could. So I thought arc of change over. Okay, I'm sorry about that. This is Margaret, this is the overview of the largest historical argument of the book from Margaret's introduction, page 3. After independence from Spain in 1821, denied full rights as citizens in the new nation, women forged their own form of citizenship in the church. They aimed to become and did become both more included and more equal to men in church institutions, as well as more obligated and responsible for maintaining family and community piety than they had been in the colonial past. Now, this is quite surprising. Okay. These reactionary feminists, as Edward Wright Rios called them, then entered the political arena on behalf of the church, defending it and their religion as fiercely as many men defended the nation. The conventional wisdom, as Margaret just pointed out, is that it took the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to open up spaces for larger numbers of women to act politically in meaningful ways in Mexico. And as she said, well, that does seem to be true for liberal or radical women, but the book shows that Catholic women had aggressively entered national politics by the 1850s. So the church's struggle to survive disestablishment and to remain relevant in the 19th century became women's struggle. Catholic women's actions put the story of the church's survival as a political actor in the 19th and 20th century in a new perspective. So I think that I wanted to just share the brilliant way that she encapsulates her own macro historical argument, just to show sort of the breadth and the scope of the argument. And then to answer the question, she does, what she has made a name for herself doing, of looking at daily life and looking at institution that other historians might have overlooked to answer such a big question about change over time in the 19th, really from the 1780s to the early 20th century. And then she looks at the way that in these lay associations, also confraternities or cofradías, the way that women held authority beginning so early in the national period, and that women forged this own form of citizenship in the church. So one of the things that I really admire about the book is this blending of social history and analysis of political discourse and behavior that Margaret made sound as just an easy decision to execute. But that's what you just said, Margaret, about you've always felt that gendered political discourse is more intelligible when placed in the context of social history. That's really profound and important. Even those examples you just cited for us of very misogynist discourse in the press, in both the Catholic and the liberal, and increase even more so the liberal press, many scholars might just sort of note it and then move on and not go so deeply into it and not intertwine it and pair it with a deep social historical analysis that makes sense of why it shifts as it does, and really chart that change over time. I don't envy you wading into so many years of the liberal press and the Catholic press and their characterization of women. I'm sure you had to hold your nose at certain times to do so, but I think you also found the humor in it. And you were able to chart this kind of shift and change over time, and this surprising reality of the way that conservatives are improbably embracing women's entry into political life in the 19th century through these lay associations and their petitions, and that liberals are confining the role of women to the home, and this strange reversal. I think that, as a read, what I love about this book is your really knack for getting into the quotidian detail of these cofradías, their day-to-day relationships and activities, how they actually worked in practice. And then you do this thing that I really admire as a historian, where the alternating of chapters between the more social history and the political discourse, that's really hard to do, to have that amount of control over your story and to weave it together in that way. And I know you teach that way too. You'll take a theme and then you'll revisit the same chronology. It's really impressive, and it's a model of scholarship. I think that chapter 4 might be my favorite, with the way that you engage with all this preposterously gendered political discourse in the press and link it to that social history of the petition drives and the associations and make it make sense. But I think that I have a bunch of questions. I would much rather dialogue with you, and I have a bunch of questions I want to ask. So let's see if there's one more point I wanted to make before we moved over. No, yeah, I'd rather just dialogue and ask some questions. And hear what Giselle has to say. So I'm just going to stop right now and just say, thank you for this book, Margaret. It's on many different levels. It does really extraordinary work for our understanding of women in Mexico and Mexican history period. So thank you. And Giselle, I'm excited we're all excited to hear from you.
Everyone, I'll try to be brief, but I wanted to comment on 3 things: interventions on Mexico historiography, method, and pose a few questions for new directions where researchers can expand after this major contribution. So Mexicanists rely, as this book shows, perhaps too readily on 1910 as a caustic moment for emergences in political participation. Catholic Women challenges the narrative of Mexican women entering abruptly in the 20th century. Instead, it argues that it was mid-19th century women of local parishes who, improving their material, social, and spiritual value for communities in Mexico Center West, coordinated door-to-door petitions in defense of Catholicism. She defines the elite cofradia as one where at least half the membership were dons and doñas, and finds that the urban cofradia, which upheld gender hierarchy in the late colony, struggled to survive after 1810 due to its colonial reliance of renting out and selling local property. This left an opening for women to advocate for leadership positions in lay associations in the 1840, though Chowning does find evidence of earlier desire and intent to form an all-women's association in the proposal for the Asociación de Señoras de la Ciudad de México. Because women's associations were not based on property and because their roles aligned with what was acceptable public behavior, like sitting watch for the Blessed Sacrament, women were able to expand their leadership roles in women's auxiliaries, the Vincentian associations, and autonomous associations like the famous Vela Perpetua. It was these Catholic women's leadership in lay associations that paved the way for future political involvement. Liberals during the Porfiriato did not perceive women's participation in devotional associations as necessarily political, but the author demonstrates that the effects of helping the poor, public displays of religiosity, certainly had meaningful political impact. Taking Catholic women seriously as agents of public political change, probing their motivations, daily responsibilities, as Elena mentioned, their impact on the local parish, their organizing. This is an important intervention to historiography that can discursively limit their actions to the 19th century liberal satire, which Margaret so readily engages with. Moving towards method, I'm consistently struck by how much you are constructing a method here. Readers of Chowning's previous works will be familiar with the deliberate efforts to understand local sources on their own terms. She creates litmus tests to evaluate sources, which for an earlier wealth and power in provincial Michoacan, one Mexicanist refers to as an impressive technical apparatus. Those who work in the 19th century and earlier will appreciate that she walks us through all too familiar archival challenges. Destroyed or incomplete documents, archived by Congress, prevents us from knowing precisely how many women's petitions against religious tolerance were filed between 1848 and 1849, for example. But Margaret suggests that no more than 200, but the fact that they commanded attention in the press means that the liberal and the conservative press saw it as meaningful, so why shouldn't we? I can point to a number of examples in Catholic women where Margaret built method in searching for the toughest questions in the field. How did the church survive the attacks on it post-independence? What happens when we apply to a gendered lens to the story? Some of the approach is data-driven, looking to the number of cofradias and their demographic makeup in 3 periods, the late colony, the reform, and the porfiriato. But because the book operates on 2 registers, the social history and the analysis of political discourse, questions of authorship for the 2 major petition drives discussed, while important, are not central to the larger argument that it was women's involvement in local parishes that advanced the Catholic political project. And for those who haven't read the book yet, I'll give one example from the 1849 Orizaba petition against religious tolerance, which is turn back this colonization project, do not sanction the introduction of heterodox sex into the Republic, and by this means cause us to lose our Catholic integrity just as we have lost our territory. This is the very patriotic objective of this petition. The petitioners assert that the family and by extension the nation suffered when women in marriage were left unprotected. Margaret concludes that it was probably men who authored the initial petitions based on tone and the letter's themes, which suggest a formal theological background. While some may dismiss or deal differently with the question of authorship, Catholic women comes to a more productive, I think, conclusion. The fact that men authored most of the petitions combined with women's work in petition drives signals their collaboration with parish priests. This is an important reminder that ordinary women remained at work as the press debated the petition drives during the mid-century. Again, just for listeners to get a sense of the splash these campaigns made, the conservative press reported in 1857, they have leaped into the fields of combat, referring to the Catholic women, with the valor that only Christianity has known how to inspire in women. They have thrown themselves in front of their tormentors, protesting energetically against infamy and sacrilege. So for the instructors that are listening too, there's a wealth of material that might be exciting for teaching purposes. And I can definitely envision this book in a class on archives, for example, or archival work. This sort of methodical informed speculation in Catholic women is useful for scholars across fields. And I'm thinking specifically too of legal scholarship recently that puts less attention on attorneys, for example, but I think it's also particularly useful for graduate students like myself looking for models when we conduct archival work. And with that, I'll pose a question about new directions. So to you, Margaret, what new avenues of research do you think this book inspires or opens up? So this book's focus on the Center West and then Hispanic mestizo towns makes me think of what the story might look like elsewhere outside of places where the collapse of the silver economy played a role in the cofradia's decline. And you give us a sense of glimpses from Durango and Oaxaca and bringing in Chihuahua and Sonora, and in the Southeast, Veracruz, Chiapas, and Yucatan. You also suggest that those who study non-Catholic associations might see a trend in greater emphasis on social events based on what you're seeing is really building the social component in the lay associations. There's also maybe potential for comparative work for students working and scholars working in the US. So to end and to open it up to conversation, where do we go from here?
Those are great comments, Giselle. Margaret, do you want to
Thanks.
answer these questions?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks to both of you. Lovely, embarrassing, but lovely comments. Thank you. I'm glad that both of you sort of drew attention to something that I didn't in my own comments, which is the sort of close to the ground local nature of my stories. I think it was sometimes hard to read the newspapers because of the misogyny, although it was so absurd that at the same time I wasn't lying awake at night. The thing that was really hard was finding this local story, these local stories, the sort of social history story more than the political story. The reading newspapers in the end is fun. The material for the social history story was correspondence, which is never categorized, never archivists just put it in a giant box and call it correspondence. A lot of correspondence is not useful, but when you find stuff in the correspondence boxes, it's the best. But it's hard. It's hard work, and not a high yield for your the time that you invest in it. So, but I am pretty committed to that idea of that it's not that I don't like the books that talk about church-state relationships and are, I don't know, more intellectual history or more sort of national level political history. I've profit from those. I value those. I actually don't think I would be very good at writing such a thing, but I'm pretty squarely in the camp of historians who look to the local for for answers to questions about faith and the role of religion in national life. So thanks for both of you highlighted that, and I really didn't. I wanted to comment on Giselle's own comment that the Vela Perpetua, the famous Vela Perpetua, it is famous. Everybody knows about the Vela Perpetua, but most people know about the Vela Perpetua as something that's a kind of ridiculous thing, a sort of grandmother thing. My grandmother dragged me to the church to help her clean as a member of the Vela Perpetua. It's but the amazing thing is that this was such a radical story when the Vela Perpetua writes this constitution that says we 31 women are propose the formation of this organization, and like a sentence later it says the officers in this organization will always be señoras. And I remember the first time I looked at it and I saw señoras, of course, it's 1839, so everything's handwritten. And I looked at it and I said, is that really an A? Is that really señoras? And am I, because it was just so shocking that here was an organization that was proposing that only women could be the officers in it. I mean, it's the power that they had was pretty trivial, but the principle of female power over a church institution was very powerful, I think. Okay, so yeah, new directions. I mean, I'd love to see somebody, and I'm actually considering doing it myself. I've already started another project that may have this as a dimension. I'd like to follow up on my argument in the book, which is one of the less well grounded arguments, and yet one of the ones that I'm really very loyal to, and that is I even included it in this very brief summary that I gave, the idea of liberal women being prevented by liberal discourse from forming clubs, from forming liberal associations until so late in the Porfiriato. I feel like the sources that I've read are absolutely confirm that view, that picture of what was going on. But I also think that there could be more research on this topic, and it's a kind of secondary argument in my book, but I think it could be, I would like to see more work on that. I'm also, I mean, I'm not trying to reserve all the good new directions for myself, but but I'm thinking about circling back to my beginnings as an economic historian and writing an article that really bears down on the economic argument I made about the wars for independence causing these profound changes that I describe in this book. I think there's a way of using the history of cofradias to provide a different lens onto regional impacts of the wars of independence. And I cut most of that out of the book manuscript, but I'm kind of all about finishing my career by circling back to being an economic historian.
Margaret, may I ask a question?
Sure.
One of the major themes that we haven't really talked, sorry, Teo's yelling.
Yeah.
One of the major themes we have about is the feminization of religion in the 19th century, and what your argument is around that, how Mexico compares to other more familiar stories. Can you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah. That's kind of a big question. I probably can't do it justice here, but for those of you who don't know, there's a big debate about the what's sometimes called the feminization of piety, sometimes called the feminization of religion. Sometimes there's something going on. Everybody kind of apprehends a little part of that, but where to place the beginnings of feminization in time, what the explanations for it are. It's a global or at least a Western phenomenon, and it's not just Catholic. It happens in the Protestant churches. It happens in the Jewish churches. So people the debates around it are super interesting. The outcome of, I think, of those debates, though, has pretty much been that it doesn't work. There's no theory that really accounts for all of the examples of the places where we see this happening. So I guess I don't have anything very profound to say on, the question of whether this is a good theory or not, other than that I agree that it doesn't really work as a theory. But I think, my book tells the story of, tells the Mexican story of the feminization of piety. And as I said in my own summary, by making the story begin in the colonial period with the female majorities in the colonial cofradias and extending it all the way through the Catholic activism of the 20s and the 30s, I make that sort of feminization of religion a story. I guess my takeaway on that topic would be every story is every place has its own story, and this is the Mexican story. This is not, I know it's unfashionable to say that globalization is not something we should be paying attention to. I absolutely don't believe that. I think there's a lot of great literature about global influences and cultural patterns. But in this case, I think the rush to see the Catholic women's activism of the 20s and 30s as a kind of reflex of Catholic women's activism globally at this time, the seeing it as global influences at work is clearly wrong in this case. And I guess it's just sort of a plea for every place telling its own story.
Well, and the precociousness of the Mexican story starting so early, Catholic women in Mexico, that this is a 19th century story. I mean, it's really,
and you don't see that the politicization part, the feminization of religion, you do see in the 19th century elsewhere, even in the 18th century, the sort of demographic, more women go to church than men, that kind of thing. But the politicization really doesn't happen this early anywhere else. So,
Janet, did you have an audience question?
Thank you.
There's
Yes,
a question in the chat. Yeah.
I
It
wanted
says-
to
yeah.
end these wonderful presentations with a question from the audience. Comes from Kyle Jackson. How broad and how integrated was the network of Catholic women within the country and across Latin America? Was this political activity mostly localized and centered in individual cofradías, or was there a wider or even transnational political world accessible to women beyond their own communities?
yeah. Hi, Kyle. So I just shot you down on that question. My response to to Elena's comment about the feminization of piety. So I do see this as a more of a local story, certainly in the period that's the center of gravity of my work, the 19th century, the early 20th century. There wasn't a transnational world accessible. That did happen in the 1920s and 1930s. We know that's true. And I think that is the reason that some of the people studying the 1920s and 1930s have been drawn to investigating the transnational connections. And it's not that those don't exist and that they're not influential, but I think by pulling the story, the origins of Catholic women's activism in Mexico back even into the colonial period. I think it's a plea, I guess, for something besides just transnational frameworks.
We have 4 more minutes. Can I ask you one last question?
Oh, just one last. Oh, I had more.
Yes, the last one. Would you say that a globalized perspective on the feminization of piety obscures the particularities and agency of Mexican conservative women?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think that would, if there were the globalized perspective does obscure the particulars. It's a very good way of putting it, Zoe. So again, for the part of the story that I really did massive archival work on, there hasn't been a perspective of a feminization of piety perspective brought to it that has obscured anything, because it's kind of it's just an unexplored topic, really. It's these are sources that have not been used. Even the newspaper sources really have not been used. Certainly the archival sources haven't been used. Since we're winding up, I'll make this a last bit of advice for graduate students. If you find sources that no one has used, you're pretty much guaranteed to have a really original book. You may not be as lucky as I was in finding the Vela Perpetua, for example, but if you are willing to dig for sources that haven't been used, you have a leg up on producing something fresh and original that isn't obeying the questions of the literature so much as it's obeying these the directions that these new sources take you.
Okay, we're gonna end this event with that advice.
Okay,
from Professor Chowning. I want to thank every one of you for joining us tonight. For the audience, any last comments you might have?
No, great. Thank you so
Okay,
much.
thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thanks.